One empire fell in a single afternoon, and the vacuum it left behind would decide the fate of 1/5 of the human race for the next 2,000 years. Most people think of India as one place, one flag, one story. But 2,500 years ago, there was no India at all. There were 16 kingdoms, 16 rival powers scattered across a landmass larger than Western Europe, each one convinced it alone deserved to rule the land between the mountains and the sea. They were called the Mahajanapadas, the Great Realms, and they spent centuries doing what rival kingdoms always do. They fought, they bled, they built walls, then broke them. In the east, in a kingdom called Magadha, something different was happening. Its kings were not the strongest, not at first, but they were patient, and patience, in the ancient world, was rarer than gold. Then, in 326 BCE, a 29-year-old Macedonian king crossed the Indus River with an army that had already conquered Persia. His name echoed through the ancient world like a curse and a promise at once. Alexander had beaten every empire that stood in his way. He expected India to fall the same way Persia had. Instead, at the banks of the Hydaspes, he met King Porus, and for the first time in his campaign, Alexander's army bled in a way it hadn't before. War elephants, unlike anything his Greek cavalry had faced, tore through his ranks. He won the battle. But something in his soldiers broke that day. They had marched for 8 years, through deserts and mountain passes, and now they stood at the edge of a subcontinent that seemed to have no end. They refused to go further. Alexander turned back. He would be dead within 3 years, and his empire would fracture into pieces before his body was even cold. But he left something behind that he never intended to leave. Chaos, right on India's doorstep. And chaos, as history keeps proving, is the soil in which the boldest men grow. A young man named Chandragupta Maurya had watched Alexander's campaign unfold. Some accounts say he even tried to meet the Macedonian king and was turned away. Humiliated, furious, and utterly without a kingdom, he did something almost no one in his position should have been able to do. He built an army from nothing, and with the guidance of a ruthless strategist named Chanakya, a man whose treatise on power would still be studied by politicians 2,000 years later, he marched on Magadha itself. He won. By 321 BCE, Chandragupta Maurya sat on the throne of the most powerful kingdom in India. But he wasn't finished. Piece by piece, kingdom by kingdom, he swallowed the land Alexander had left in disorder. Within a decade, he controlled more territory than any Indian ruler before him. The Mauryan Empire had begun, and for the first time, something resembling a single Indian power stretched from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal. His grandson would take that empire and turn it into something the world had never seen. But first, he would have to become one of history's most brutal conquerors. His name was Ashoka. For years, Ashoka fought to expand the empire his grandfather had built, and in 261 BCE, he set his sights on Kalinga, a kingdom on India's eastern coast that had somehow remained independent. The war that followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Ancient records claim over 100,000 people were killed, and hundreds of thousands more were displaced or enslaved. Ashoka won. He stood on a battlefield soaked in the blood of a kingdom he had just erased, and by his own account carved into stone edicts that still exist today. Something inside him shattered. He looked at what victory actually looked like up close, and he could not bear it. In the years that followed, Ashoka renounced violent conquest entirely. He converted to Buddhism, and instead of expanding his empire through war, he expanded an idea. He sent missionaries as far as Greece, Egypt, and Sri Lanka. He carved messages of tolerance, nonviolence, and justice onto pillars and rocks across the subcontinent, many of which still stand. A man who had once ordered the annihilation of a kingdom became one of the ancient world's most powerful voices for peace. It is one of history's strangest transformations, and almost no one outside India learns about it in school. But empires built on the willpower of one extraordinary man rarely survive his death. Ashoka died around 232 BCE, and within 50 years, the Mauryan Empire had crumbled into fragments. For the next 5 centuries, India fractured again. Regional kingdoms rose and fell. Foreign powers, from Central Asian nomads to Greek-descended rulers in the northwest, carved out territories of their own. It would take another 500 years before anything close to unity returned. When it did, it arrived under a dynasty that historians still call India's Golden Age, the Guptas. Under rulers like Chandragupta I and his successors, northern India entered a period of such extraordinary achievement that its effects are still felt today, whether people realize it or not. Mathematicians in Gupta India developed the concept of zero as a number, not just a placeholder, an idea so fundamental to modern civilization that without it, there is no algebra, no computer science, no modern engineering. The decimal system that the entire world now uses to count, to trade, and to calculate was refined here. Astronomers like Aryabhata calculated the length of a solar year with a margin of error of just a few minutes, using nothing but observation and mathematics, over 1,000 years before Copernicus proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun. Physicians wrote medical texts describing surgical techniques that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another millennium. Sanskrit literature flourished. Temples were carved with astonishing precision. Trade routes connected India to Rome in the west and China in the east, and Roman writers complained, quite bitterly, about how much gold was leaving their empire to pay for Indian spices, silk, and gemstones. For a while, it must have felt like nothing could threaten this. Then, in the 5th century, a new force arrived from Central Asia. The Hunas, cousins of the same nomadic warriors who were simultaneously tearing the Roman Empire apart on the other side of the world, poured through the mountain passes into northern India. The Gupta Empire, weakened by decades of war against these invaders, began to collapse from within. By the middle of the 6th century, the Golden Age was over, and India entered another long era of fragmentation, regional kingdoms, and shifting power. But something was coming from the west that would change India more permanently than any invasion before it. In 712 CE, an Arab general named Muhammad bin Qasim led forces into the Sindh region, bringing Islam to the subcontinent for the first time. For the next 3 centuries, this remained a regional foothold, not a conquest. But in the 11th century, a far more aggressive force arrived. Mahmud of Ghazni launched a series of devastating raids into northern India, 17 of them by some accounts, targeting the region's wealthiest temples for their gold and gemstones. These were not conquests meant to hold territory. They were extraction. Mahmud took what he wanted and returned to Central Asia each time, leaving devastated cities behind him. But he had shown something important to those who came after him. Northern India was wealthy, and northern India was, in that era, militarily vulnerable to disciplined cavalry forces from Central Asia. Others took note. By 1206, a former slave-turned-general named Qutb-ud-Din Aibak had established the Delhi Sultanate, the first sustained Islamic empire to control large portions of northern India. What followed were 3 centuries of shifting dynasties, the Mamluks, the Khaljis, the Tughlaqs, each rising through ambition and brutality, each eventually collapsing under the weight of rebellion, invasion, or their own internal decay. Then in 1398, a conqueror even more terrifying than anything India had faced arrived at Delhi's gates. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, sacked the city with a savagery that horrified even his own chroniclers. Contemporary accounts describe pyramids of skulls built from the city's slaughtered population. He didn't stay. Like Mahmud before him, he took what he wanted and left, but Delhi would take generations to recover. Out of this chaos in the 16th century, one of history's most consequential dynasties would rise, not through savagery, but eventually through something closer to genius. In 1526, a Central Asian prince named Babur, a descendant of both Timur and the Mongol conqueror Genghis Khan, crossed into India with an army far smaller than the forces waiting to meet him. At the Battle of Panipat, He faced the Sultan of Delhi's army, which vastly outnumbered his own. But Babur had something his enemy didn't: cannons and matchlock guns, weapons rarely seen on Indian battlefields at that scale. Gunpowder shattered the old rules of warfare that day, and Babur won an empire he almost certainly shouldn't have. The Mughal Empire had begun, though it nearly ended before it truly started. Babur's son Humayun lost the throne entirely, was exiled from India for over a decade, and had to reconquer it by force. It would take Babur's grandson to turn a fragile conquest into one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. Akbar took the throne as a teenager in 1556, and what he built over the next 50 years still shapes how historians think about religious tolerance in pre-modern empires. He was a Muslim ruler governing a population that was overwhelmingly Hindu, and rather than rule through suppression, he abolished the tax that had been placed specifically on non-Muslims. He married into Rajput Hindu royal families, brought Hindu nobles into his highest administrative ranks, and hosted debates between Muslim scholars, Hindu priests, Christian missionaries, and Zoroastrian thinkers in his own court, genuinely curious about ideas beyond his own faith. Under Akbar and the rulers who followed him, the Mughal Empire became staggeringly wealthy. Its capital cities were larger than London or Paris at the time. Its treasury, by some historical estimates, controlled roughly a quarter of the entire world's economic output at its peak, a figure so large it's difficult to comprehend today. The Taj Mahal, built by Akbar's grandson Shah Jahan as a tomb for his wife, would become the most recognizable monument on earth. A single act of grief translated into white marble that still draws millions of visitors 4 centuries later. But empires, no matter how wealthy, carry the seeds of their own unraveling. Shah Jahan's son, Aurangzeb, took the throne after imprisoning his own father and executing his brothers in a brutal war of succession. Unlike his predecessors, Aurangzeb reversed the policies of tolerance that had held the empire together. He reinstated taxes on non-Muslims, destroyed temples in politically contested regions, and spent the final decades of his reign locked in an unwinnable war against the Marathas, a rising Hindu confederacy in the south that refused to be conquered no matter how many campaigns he threw at them. By the time Aurangzeb died in 1707, the Mughal treasury was hollowed out, his armies exhausted, and the empire he inherited at its absolute peak was already beginning to fracture beneath him. And into that fracture stepped a company that had originally arrived not as conquerors, but as merchants. The English East India Company had been trading in India since the early 1600s, dealing in spices, textiles, and tea, operating with the Mughal emperor's permission. For over a century, they were guests in someone else's empire. But as Mughal central authority weakened, regional governors began acting as independent rulers in all but name, and the company, with its private army and its ruthless commercial instincts, began doing something no one had fully anticipated. It started taking sides. In 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, the East India Company's forces, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal, not primarily through superior numbers, but through bribery and betrayal, having secretly turned the Nawab's own military commander against him before the battle even began. It was a turning point disguised as a minor regional skirmish. A private trading corporation, answerable to shareholders in London, had just become the effective ruler of one of the wealthiest provinces on earth. Over the following century, the company expanded its control across the subcontinent through a combination of military conquest, manipulated treaties, and the calculated exploitation of rivalries between Indian states. Bengal, once among the richest regions in the world, saw its textile industry deliberately dismantled to protect British manufacturing interests. Famine, worsened by company policy, killed millions. By 1858, following a massive uprising known as the Indian Rebellion, control passed directly to the British Crown. India was no longer merely under corporate influence. It was now, formally, the most valuable possession in the largest empire the world had ever known. For nearly 90 years, India existed under direct colonial rule, its resources extracted, its political voice suppressed, its people governed by laws they had no part in writing. But suppression, as it almost always does, eventually produced resistance. In 1915, a lawyer who had spent over 2 decades fighting discrimination in South Africa returned home to India. Mohandas Gandhi did not lead with armies. He led with something the British colonial administration had almost no answer for: mass non-violent resistance, salt marches, boycotts, civil disobedience on a scale never attempted before. Millions of ordinary Indians, farmers, students, workers, joined a movement that refused to meet violence with violence, and in doing so made colonial rule morally and politically unsustainable on the world stage. The movement was not without division. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, once a colleague within the independence movement, came to believe that India's Muslim population would face permanent marginalization within a Hindu-majority nation, and pushed instead for a separate homeland. On August 15, 1947, India finally achieved independence, but the celebration was inseparable from catastrophe. The subcontinent was partitioned into 2 nations, India and Pakistan, along lines drawn hastily by a British lawyer who had never even visited the region before being assigned the task. An estimated 14 million people were displaced within weeks. Communal violence between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs erupted along the new borders, and somewhere between 1 and 2 million people are believed to have died in the chaos. Gandhi himself, the man who had led India to freedom through non-violence, would be assassinated just months later, in January 1948, by a Hindu nationalist who believed he had been too accommodating toward Pakistan. Independence had arrived, but it arrived soaked in the same kind of blood that had marked so much of the subcontinent's history before it. What came next surprised almost everyone who had predicted India's collapse. Newly independent, deeply impoverished and fractured along religious and linguistic lines that outside observers assumed would tear the country apart within a decade, India instead did something remarkable. It held together. It built the largest democracy the world has ever seen, one that today includes well over 1 billion citizens casting votes across dozens of languages and religions. It weathered wars, famine, and economic crisis, and by the early 1990s, faced with a balance of payments crisis so severe the country nearly ran out of foreign currency reserves, it made a decision that would define its next 30 years. India opened its economy, deregulation, foreign investment, and a technology sector that would eventually make Indian engineers and software developers indispensable to companies across the globe, transformed the country from one of the poorest nations on earth into one of its largest economies. Today, more than 1,700 years after Aryabhata calculated the length of a year with startling precision, more than 2,000 years after Ashoka carved messages of peace into stone after a war that haunted him for the rest of his life, India stands as the most populous nation on the planet, a nuclear power, and one of the fastest-growing major economies in the world. The kingdoms that once fought each other into exhaustion, the Macedonian king who turned back at its border, the conqueror turned pacifist who built pillars of peace, the empire that gave the world the number 0, the Mughal court that once controlled 1/4 of the planet's wealth, the company that turned trade into conquest, the lawyer who dismantled an empire without firing a single shot. Every one of them is still here, layered into the streets, the languages, the architecture, and the identity of a nation that refused, again and again, across 2,500 years, to disappear. If you enjoy documentaries that uncover the hidden forces that shaped our world, consider subscribing for more stories that continue to shape our future.